Thank you for joining me as we continue to read from the Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart. Today we'll be starting with the chapter called Logical Conclusions and Miscalculations. When the ceiling panel slid aside that night, Kate was the only face that appeared. "Where's Constance?" Rainey whispered. "Down for the count," Kate replied. "Drowsiest kid I've ever met. Fell asleep at her desk. I couldn't wake her." "I guess you can fill her in later," Rainey said doubtfully, and Sticky shook his head with a look of disapproval. "I'm so glad to see you boys," Kate said, sitting on the floor. She crossed her legs in an elaborate pretzel-like formation the boys would have thought impossible. "I'm sick of studying. I must have gone over my notes 100 times, but none of it sticks in my head. It makes no sense. You must work longer hours to have more time to relax. You must have war to have peace. How are those logical conclusions? Please tell me." Rainey gave a weary laugh. "What about it's important to protect yourself because it's impossible to protect yourself?" "Oh yes, the hygiene lesson," Kate said disgustedly. "That one's the best. I would never have thought brushing my teeth could make me feel so hopeless." Rainey cocked his head. Something about what Kate said seemed familiar. But what was it? "The stuff doesn't make a bit of sense to me either," said Sticky, "but I don't have trouble remembering it. I can help you study, Kate." "When?" Kate said, exasperated. "There's never any time. No, I need to just do it myself." Oh, okay," said Sticky meekly, his feelings obviously hurt. Kate was too preoccupied to notice. She was absently braiding her hair into complicated knots, then unbraiding it again. "I really don't get it, boys. What's the point of learning this mush?" It suddenly occurred to Rainey what had struck him as familiar. "I think it's connected to the hidden messages. Remember that phrase we heard on the receiver? Brush your teeth and kill the germs? That has to be related to the hygiene lesson, don't you think?" "Hey, you're right," Kate said, brightening. "And now that I think of it, on our first day here, we overheard the kids in SQ's class going on and on about the market this, the market that." "The free market drill," said Sticky. "Exactly. And market was the very first word we heard come through Mr. Benedict's receiver, remember?" Sticky nodded. Of course he remembered, but Kate only shrugged. "I'll have to take your word for it," she said. "Anyway, the classes are obviously linked to the hidden messages, so the question is how it all fits together." "The sooner we become messengers, the sooner we find out," said Rainey excitedly. "We aren't messengers yet, so hold your horses," said Sticky, who was still trying to recover from his wounded feelings and felt a bit testy. We've only been here a few days." "It's true," Rainey sighed. "All right, let's report this to Mr. Benedict." They prepared to send a report to the mainland, only to be thwarted by the presence of Mr. Curtin on the plaza. And then, just as Mr. Curtin was finally going inside, a couple of executives came out for a leisurely stroll over the Institute grounds. They seemed intent on strolling every walkway and path in sight. The night was growing late, and the children, exhausted, decided to adjourn. They couldn't very well succeed in their classes if they couldn't stay awake for them. "The report will keep," Kate said with a yawn, "and in the meantime we'll sleep. You boys have a good night." She scurried up her rope, drew it into the ceiling after her, and disappeared. With a mixture of amusement and admiration, Rainey and Sticky watched her go. Kate's method of coming and going still took some getting used to. What must it be like getting around the way she does? Sticky wondered. Rainey shrugged. "Dusty, I imagine." Long after Kate had gone her dusty way and the boys had gone to bed, Rainey lay awake, calming his nerves by composing a mental letter to Miss Perumal. He could never actually write the letter, of course. He could never send it, but it soothed Rainey to think of Miss Perumal, in a setting far from this responsibility and danger, sipping her tea and correcting his Tamil grammar. He reflected upon the pleasant afternoons they'd spent walking in Oldwood Park, discussing this thing or that, her mother, or the aged trees in the park, or baseballs or dogs, and the times, too, when he'd told her about some savage teasing he'd got from other children, upon which Miss Perumal never offered advice, which would have been useless. but only nodded and clucked her tongue, smiling sadly at Rainey as if his memory were her memory too, as if they shared it. Well, he supposed they did share it, now that he told her of it, and somehow this had always lightened its effect on him, even on occasion cheered him right up. Rainey had just ended the letter when he heard Sticky rise and move about the room, and then, after a pause, whisper, "Rainey, are you awake?" It would have been a nice way to go to sleep. Rainey was feeling calm for the first time all day, but he couldn't very well thank Miss Perumal in his letter for always being there to listen, then turn around and not be there for Sticky. "Yes, I'm awake," he replied. "The coast is clear now." Rainey looked down from his bunk. Sticky had put on his spectacles and was peering out the window. "If Kate hadn't taken her flashlight, we could send the report. We should remember that next time. We might as well get something out of a bad night's sleep." "We could flip the light switch," Rainey suggested. "I suppose so," Sticky said doubtfully with a twinge of worry in his voice. "But what if there's someone outside? I can't keep an eye out from over by the light switch." "There are two of us, remember? I'll watch out the window." Sticky was casting about for his polishing cloth. "Makes me nervous," he said, finding the cloth on his desk and giving his glasses a brisk rub. "I keep thinking about that messenger's face when Jackson told him about the waiting room. The last thing we want is to be suspected of something." He put his glasses on and sighed. "Now I wish I hadn't mentioned it, but I suppose we ought to." "We'll do it quickly and get it over with," Rainey said. The light switch, unfortunately, made a sharp clicking sound when it was thrown. Sticky cringed with every click, as if he were being shocked, and by the end of the message, his trembling, sweaty fingers were slipping off the switch. At last, the message was sent, however, and no one had discovered them. Peering down the mainland shore, Rainey chuckled. "They want to know what we're still doing up." Sticky felt too anxious to smile. "Anything else?" "We're doing excellent work. We must continue to be careful, and now we should really get some sleep." "They said all that?" Rainey climbed down from the television. "Well, they said excellent, careful sleep." "They don't have to tell me twice," Sticky said, slipping into bed. "Especially not the careful part. My stomach's all in knots, Rainey. It feels that way all the time." "I know," Rainey said, climbing up on his bunk. "Same with me, but at least we know Mr. Benedict and his crew are out there watching. We're not alone, right?" "I suppose that should be encouraging," Sticky said uncertainly. "I take it you don't find it very encouraging." "No," Sticky replied, pulling his sheet up tightly under his chin. "No, ever since I first saw him, I keep imagining Mr. Curtin chasing me down, getting closer and closer. Seems a lot closer than Mr. Benedict and the others do, way off on that shore." This time, Rainey said nothing. He understood too well how Sticky felt. If only he knew of something comforting to say, something to ease Sticky's anxiety, and yes, something to ease his own. He thought and thought. He lay awake a long while thinking. Surely there was something, but if there was, he could not think of it. Sticky's anxiety took its toll on him. He slept quite poorly, and all the next morning he had trouble staying awake. By the time Jackson's class started, his eyelids felt heavy as anvils. It required a heroic effort, including a lot of painful pinches on the leg, to keep his eyes open and pay attention to Jackson's long, droning lecture. At last, Jackson finished, however, and despite his drowsiness, Sticky had managed to lock all the information securely in his head. The end of lecture review would not require his attention, which meant it would require willpower instead. It would be all he could do to stay awake. He needed to occupy his mind with something. And so Sticky focused on Corliss Danton, who was back in class this morning, looking no worse for the wear. On the contrary, he seemed the exemplary student. He sat ramrod straight in his desk, listening with attention, and his messenger uniform was impeccable. In fact, his entire person fairly shone. From finger to foot, his fair skin was rosy from scrubbing. Even his fingernails seemed meticulously groomed. He looked as though he would smell like a bar of soap. Corliss obviously meant to make a good impression, Sticky thought. He wanted to appear cleansed of any past wrongdoings. Only after Corliss had glanced past him towards the door a few times did Sticky realize he was not entirely recovered from his visit to the waiting room. His face was weary, even dazed, as if he hadn't slept a wink, and an unmistakable remnant of misery shone in his eyes. Not for the first time, Sticky found himself wondering what sort of ordeal Corliss had gone through. Then he found that he didn't want to think about it, as it made his stomach hurt. And then he found that he was asleep. Sticky wouldn't have known he was asleep, though, had Martina Crow not hissed, "You! Skinny, bald-headed Four Eyes! What are you doing sleeping? Aren't you supposed to be the super student?" Sticky's eyes snapped open. On all sides of him, students were tittering, and the messengers, including Corliss, were sneering disdainfully. In a flush of embarrassment, Sticky reached for his spectacles. "Watch him go to polishing his glasses now," said Martina. "What a weirdo." "Silence!" shouted Jackson from the front of the room. His icy sharp gaze fell on Sticky. "You can say whatever you like when you have permission," Jackson said, adding, "Right now, no one has permission." Paralyzed, Sticky couldn't even manage to nod. Kate, however, was too outraged to hold her tongue. But it wasn't Sticky who spoke. Martina, who happened to be sitting right in front of Kate, whirled about with a look of shock. Kate met her gaze defiantly, which surprised Martina even more. Before they could exchange words, though, Jackson had come charging down the aisle to stand over Kate. "Did you raise your hand to ask permission to speak?" Kate shook her head, and then, with a bright look, raised her hand. "No," Jackson said. "You don't have permission to raise your hand. And let me warn you and your friend," he said with a glance at Sticky, "it won't benefit you to challenge a messenger." Martina ran a hand through her raven-colored hair and nodded with remarkable smugness. Kate's face burned bright red. She fairly radiated fury. But she held her tongue. Jackson returned to the front of the room, and the students returned to their busy note-taking, all except Sticky, who was too upset to concentrate. Instead, he stared miserably at Jackson, and then at his other tormentor. Martina, who seemed exceedingly pleased with herself, his gaze was distracted by movement below Martina's desk. Kate was slipping her feet back into her shoes. But why had she taken her shoes off? It was too cool for bare feet. Just then, Martina shot a glance towards Sticky. Sticky averted his eyes and didn't look in that direction again. He could feel the malice even without looking. And so it was that when Jackson dismissed class and Martina leapt from her seat, Sticky heard but did not see Martina crashing face first onto the floor. He glanced over in surprise. Notebooks, papers, and pencils had spilled everywhere, and Martina was raising herself slowly to her hands and knees, spluttering and shaking her head as she tried to get her bearings. Messenger or no, her fumblings prompted a burst of laughter from the other students, except for Kate, who pretended not to notice as she grabbed Sticky's arms, dragging him toward the door. "I tied her shoelaces to the desk," she whispered, "with my toes." "Great," Constance said at lunch. "Not only do we have a dangerous secret mission, but now we have enemies too. Nice work, Kate." Kate laughed. "She was already the boys' enemy. I just added myself to the list. What did you expect me to do, let her get away with it? She called him bald-headed, for Pete's sake." "I am bald," Sticky said, running a hand over his scalp. "It's my own fault. I used hair remover when I ran away to disguise myself." "That explains it," says Rainey. "I'd wondered but was afraid to ask." "Isn't hair remover supposed to sting like the dickens?" Kate asked. "I'd heard that too, so I invented my own mixture, adding other ingredients to keep it from stinging." "Did that work?" Constance asked, plainly hoping it didn't. "No," Sticky admitted. "It felt like my head was on fire, and now that it's taking forever for my hair to grow back, it hasn't even started." The others smiled, then grinned, then giggled, and finally, unable to help themselves, they burst out laughing. Sticky groaned and ducked his head, but at last, even he had to smile. For a while, their laughter wiped away the troubles at hand, and they were reluctant to give it up. But eventually, too soon, their laughter fell away. And unlike Sticky's hair, the troubles at hand did not hesitate to come back. And that is the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called Poison Apples, Poison Worms. That afternoon in class, Jilson lectured on the national economy. She also spoke about education, crime, the environment, war, taxes, insurance, health and medicine, the justice system, and fruit. You see, Jilson said near the end of the lesson, all these terrible problems are the result of one thing: bad government. Don't get me wrong, government is a good thing. Without government, you can solve none of the world's horrible problems, unless you have a bad government, in which case the problem only gets more horrible. Sadly, all the world's governments are bad ones, like a poison apple. Here, Rainie's ears perked up. Our governments look beautiful, shiny, and wholesome from a distance, but once you've partaken of them, they prove quite deadly. What's more, they shelter more than one wicked official, like poison worms in that poison apple. Poison apples, poison worms, Rainie thought. That was another hidden message phrase they'd heard through Mr. Benedict's receiver. He wasn't surprised. He knew the classes were connected to the hidden messages, but he did wonder exactly how it all fit together. He felt sure he could figure it out. If only. Without warning, Rainie's mood shifted. His optimism drained away, and he was suddenly angry with Jilson. Stupid lectures, Jilson. And not just Jilson either, but really he was angry with just about everybody he could think of. It was an unusual feeling for Rainie and very distressing. He felt as though the walls were pressing in on him, as though he wanted to get up and run from the room. He felt like yelling and kicking things, preferably Jilson. What was going on? Was the pressure finally getting to him? Completely frazzled, Rainie laid down his pencil and glanced over at Sticky, who was glaring at his quiz as if he wanted to tear it up and toss it in the fire. Oh no, Rainie thought. He's bungled it somehow. For a moment, he felt mad at Sticky too. But then Sticky, catching his eye, nodded as usual and gave a feeble thumbs up. It wasn't the quiz then. And now Sticky was staring at Rainie with a concerned expression, which was how Rainie realized he was scowling himself. He looked over at Kate and Constance. Both had their heads in their hands and looked ready to scream. And yet none of the other students seemed affected in the least. So why would only the four of them? Martina's poisoned us, Rainie thought. He was immediately convinced of it. Martina had slipped something into their lunches. Perhaps she'd ordered the helpers to do it. All his anger now flowed in Martina's direction. When class was finally over, it took Rainie several seconds to realize why the other students were getting up and leaving. Jilson was staring at him and his friends as if they were a bunch of lunatics. I said go, she barked, or do you want to stay here all day? The four of them bolted from their desks. They needed an emergency meeting. More students were headed to the gym to play games before supper, and Mr. Curtin was not in his favorite spot. The plaza was deserted. The children crossed to the farthest corner, made sure no one was in earshot, and all began talking at once. Are you feeling what I'm feeling? Rainie asked. What's this all about? Kate said. So you feel it too? I think my head's going to split open, Sticky said. My first thought was Martina poisoned us, Rainie said. But poison? Kate said. No, I don't think so. This is all in my head. Rainie and Sticky agreed. It wasn't a physical problem. Exactly. It was something else. But then what was it? The three of them began comparing their symptoms. Only Constance said nothing. She listened as the others talked about how irritable and angry they felt, as if they were engaged in a furious argument. And as they spoke, she seemed to be shrinking. It was Rainie who noticed this. That Constance, with a look of anxious bafflement, had begun to crouch down as if to protect herself from an attack. Constance, what is it? Rainie asked, his brow wrinkling with concern. What's wrong? That's all? Constance asked in a weak voice. You just feel kind of annoyed? Extremely annoyed, Kate said. Really, I've never felt so cranky in my life. So you don't hear? Constance trailed off. She didn't have to finish. Rainey couldn't believe they hadn't thought of it right away. The experience must have rattled every bit of sense out of all their heads. Hadn't Mr. Benedict specifically predicted this? Most of us will simply feel irritated and confused, Mr. Benedict had said, essentially the way we feel now whenever the television is on and the messages are being broadcast. Mr. Curtin's boosting the power, Rainey said gravely, and when Kate and Sticky looked at him, still not comprehending, he said, "It's the hidden messages. Our minds are reacting to them." Sticky gasped. Kate slapped her forehead. Of course, the hidden messages had begun to transmit directly into their minds. No more need for television, radios, or anything else. All the other students were undisturbed because, just as Mr. Benedict had said, only minds with an unusual, powerful love of truth noticed anything was happening. "So we can't avoid them anymore?" Kate said. "Well, that's depressing." "I think there's more," Rainey said. He knelt beside Constance and put his hand on her shoulder, and Constance, for once, didn't complain. "There is more, isn't there, Constance?" Kate and Sticky looked from Rainey to Constance, who was nodding and hiding her face behind her hands. She actually seemed to be fighting back tears. All of their minds were resisting the hidden messages, but Constance, and only Constance, could hear the messenger's voice. In rare cases, with exceptionally sensitive minds, Mr. Benedict had said, and here was such a case, such a mind, Constance contraire. The development shocked them all, especially Constance, who was so disturbed by it she spent the evening with her head under her pillow. She was no better by the time Kate smuggled her into the boys' room for their meeting. "It might be useful, you know," Sticky whispered, trying to cheer her up, "a way to gauge Mr. Curtin's progress. On a really, really awful day, one of us might not be able to tell the difference between a normal bad mood and a hidden message mood. But if you can hear the actual voices, well then, you're like our canary in the coal mine." "A canary in a coal mine?" Constance mumbled without looking up. Sticky failed to notice Rainey's warning look. "Oh yes, miners used to bring canaries with them to gauge oxygen levels in the mine. If the canary died, they knew the oxygen was running out and they'd better get out of there." "If the canary died," Constance repeated. Sticky looked suddenly regretful. "That was perhaps an unfortunate comparison," Rainey said. "The point is, you're important," Kate said. "Okay?" "I already knew that," Constance snapped. "I didn't need all this mumbo-jumbo in my head to tell me. And I definitely didn't need Martina Crow in there whispering it. She was the one doing the last message, in case you're wondering. I dislike her enough outside my head, much less inside it. In fact, I think I'll write an insulting poem about her. Although, come to think of it, Martina makes for a tricky rhyme." Rainey, Kate, and Sticky glanced at one another with cautious optimism. Constance seemed to be feeling a little better. They all were, actually. They had spent the evening adjusting to the hidden message broadcasts. There had been 3 more since Jilson's class. Trying not to snarl at one another or smash their fists on desktops or slam drawers, studying had been positively excruciating. Like trying to read while someone bangs out an annoying tune on the piano, and with fingers on the wrong keys at that. But an hour had passed since the last broadcast, and the children's moods had improved, which helped them focus on the fact that their situation, unfortunately, had not. The thing to come was getting closer. Mr. Curtin was not broadcasting his messages at full power yet, otherwise all 4 of them would hear voices, not just Constance. But matters had obviously worsened, and the children had only just arrived on the island. Were they already too late? What should they do? "Coast is clear," Sticky said when he climbed onto the television and looked out the window. He took the flashlight from Kate. "What should I say?" "Mr. Benedict will already know the messages are stronger," Rainey reflected. "He and the others are surely feeling it too. Just tell him that Constance is hearing voices. He hadn't expected that." "Got it," Sticky said, turning to the window. Constance hearing voices. Here goes. But don't use her real name, Rainey warned. Oh, right, Sticky said sheepishly. Of course not. Are you just trying to get me caught, George Washington? Constance grumped. Sorry, Sticky said, gritting his teeth as he always did when Constance used his full name. I'll just say, he looked to the others for help. Rainey glanced at Constance, who was scowling impressively, ready to complain about whatever they suggested. Resisting the first thing that came to mind, Rainey suggested they refer to her as the smallest one. Constance grudgingly accepted this, and soon Sticky had sent the message. A few minutes later, he received a response from the mainland. Time is shorter than we thought. Thus, to get what must be got, you must become what you are not. It sounds like he wants us to put a rush on things, said Sticky, climbing down from the television. Fine by me, said Kate. But how exactly? What does he mean, what must be got? Whatever it is, we have to become something different to get it, Rainey said. But what could that be? Constance said. They all looked at one another. None of them had any idea. They didn't even know where to start. That is the end of the chapter, and please join me when we read a surprising suggestion.